Well, I'll kick it off then. A formal thank you to Zach and to HPS for putting this together. For those of you who aren't aware, Zach Moller is a senior policy analyst with the CRFB, that's the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. He researches economic, revenue, and budgetary issues. In addition, Zach contributes to the committee's Better Budget Process Initiative. Prior to joining the committee, he worked on economic and revenue issues for the Senate Budget Committee under Chairs Murray and Conrad, first as economic staff assistant and then as economic analyst. Received a bachelor's degree in econ from University of Florida, a master's degree in econ from University of Virginia. We've been very happy that Zach has actually joined us in judging the College Fiscal Challenge National Championship last year. We hope to do so again, and this is the first of other potential webinars, and I just want to thank you in advance, Zach, for taking the time to speak with us today.
Oh, it's no problem.
So let me turn it over to you.
Okay, I'm resuming screen sharing. Oh, that didn't work. Am I on the front screen with everybody? Okie dokie. All right. Well, thank you so much for everyone coming and paying attention, listening to this webinar. I hope it's informative. As Mike mentioned, I'm a senior policy analyst at the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. We're a federal budget-oriented think tank here in Washington, D.C. So that means my day-to-day is looking at legislation, keeping track of what's going on Capitol Hill and with the president, and as it relates to proposals to the federal budget and fiscal policy in general. So I put together this presentation for you guys just to kind of lay the land of what the federal budget looks like and kind of where it's heading, which is the fiscal challenge that we, of course, face as a nation. So, all right, so this first chart is the debt to GDP ratio. This is historic, going back to about World War II and to current, and then with some 10-year projections. When we refer to the debt, we can refer to it in a variety of different ways. One is the nominal debt, so the debt in dollars. But from an economic point of view, we tend to value debt as a share of the economy. So this is the debt to GDP ratio. Most of what I'll be talking about today with regards to the debt is debt to GDP. So GDP is the nominal GDP in any given year. That's your denominator. And your numerator in the equation is debt held by the public. Debt held by the public is generally considered the most economically relevant measure of public debt in the United States. That is debt that's held by financial institutions. It's debt held by you and me in the form of treasury bonds. It's debt held by foreign countries like Japan and China. And it's also debt held by the Federal Reserve. What it's missing is debt that's the government owes to itself. This is usually in the form of trust funds. So like Social Security, if you had a summer job and you've paid Social Security payroll tax, that money is kind of in this Social Security trust fund, and the Social Security trust fund is filled with special treasury bonds that essentially the government owes itself. That is not included in this debt to GDP ratio. So as you can see, if you see this Trump 77% on the right-hand side of your screen, the debt to GDP ratio is about 77% of GDP right now. If you were to talk about gross debt, which includes the debt the government owes itself, that'd be higher. That'd be just about 100%. And as you can see, the debt as a share of the economy right now is quite high historically. It was this level under the Truman administration. You can see it peaked in the late 40s, just after World War II, at 103% of the economy, and then steadily declined for for many decades as a result of generally economic growth and sound fiscal policy. And then, as you can see, starting in the late 70s, early 80s, it starts to rise again. and then it falls again in the 90s, in the economic growth of the 90s. And then we see it jump back up again in the late, just before 2010. So this is the Great Recession. So this, we had a large recession in 2008, 2009. The economy shrank, federal government spending went up as a result, revenue shrank, and so we saw a large increase in debt. So that's the problem we face today. But this is looking at debt over the long term. This is debt projections out until 2050. So as you can see, we're about 77% of GDP now, but it's going to rise and rise to over 100% of the economy, past historic records by 2035, and then up over 150% of GDP by 2050. Now this is, it's not a problem today, but the thing is the unsustainable fiscal path can eventually become a problem. And that is why people here in Washington, D.C., and many people across the country, when I've talked to them in various fiscal exercises, are concerned about it, because it's a growing problem, and the projections are showing that it's going to be a growing problem. The projections could show that it was not a growing problem. If that would be the case, then we would be a lot less worried about it. The fact of the matter is with the aging of the baby boomer population, with insufficient revenue, growing spending, we're talking about a problem that's growing and projected to grow, to shrink. And just as a note, these projections I'm using come from the Congressional Budget Office. The Congressional Budget Office is kind of the gold standard when we talk about fiscal projections. They run what they call a current law baseline, which is essentially if Congress doesn't change its promises, if policymakers here in Washington do not change their promises that they've made, and everything going forward is as current law, then this is what's going to happen. It's not a true do-nothing situation, because you might have various trust funds that go bankrupt, but in these cases, assumed to continue going forward. So as you can see, debt over the long term is a large and growing problem. So where does the money come from, and where does it go? So this is, these bar charts are for 2017 and 2027. Congress and us in Washington, D.C. typically operate in this 10-year window. This 10-year, we look at this year and we look at the 10 years going forward, and that's how they evaluate legislation. So a lot of my data will go out to 2027. So let's look at the first bar here. This is a breakdown of spending in the United States as a share of, as a percent of GDP. And we have all these different categories, these different buckets of spending. We have at the base discretionary spending. Discretionary spending is what Congress chooses to spend money on every year through what is called the appropriations process. That is money that they say, all right, we're going to pass a bill and we're going to spend this money on this specific thing. The rest of that, the rest of the whole bar outside of discretionary spending is kind of on autopilot. It's authorized to keep spending unless the law changes. So when we talk about the government shutting down, which was a concern that was going to happen at the end of September, but then the president made a deal with the Democratic leaders in Congress, that discretionary spending would have led to a government shutdown. But a lot of healthcare spending, a lot of Social Security spending would have kept going without it. So right now, discretionary spending, what is annually decided upon every year, is kind of the largest bucket of spending. That is divided about half in defense spending and half in what we call non-defense discretionary spending. That's just a fancy way of saying everything else the government normally spends its money on through the appropriations process, that's not defense. So that's a lot of education spending. That's a lot of roads and bridges. That's a lot of agency level spending. So when you talk about what the Department of the Interior spends its money on, that's that. And then the next bucket is healthcare. Healthcare is a large and growing part of the budget. Healthcare is made up of the Medicare program for the elderly. It's made up of Medicaid, which is the the healthcare funding or healthcare spending that goes to low-income populations, and which was expanded as part of the Affordable Care Act, or also known as Obamacare. And then this healthcare category also includes the subsidies on the healthcare exchanges that were part of Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. The next big category of spending is Social Security. This is our old age retirement program that we have for the elderly in the United States. You can initially get benefits starting at 62. Your standard retirement age is about 65, 66, and it's on its way up to 67 through changes in current law. The next category of spending is other mandatory spending. This is often your social safety net spending. This is food stamps or the SNAP program. This is unemployment insurance and other things like that. And occasionally some other student loan programs also fall into other mandatory spending. And then the last category is interest. So we've accumulated a very large debt, about 77% of the economy, over $14 trillion right now. So, and we pay interest on that because of the bonds. So that's a small part of spending now, but it's going to be a growing part of spending. Let's look at revenue. So the government takes in revenue in a lot of different ways. One is through the personal income tax system. So that's when you work, you fill out a W-2. That's what the government is taking out. That is your personal income tax. And we have the payroll tax. That is what you pay into Social Security and Medicare, your FICA taxes. And then the corporate income tax, which is a small part of the budget, but is often talked about a lot, and you'd read about it a lot when we're talking about tax reform or tax cuts right now. That's the corporate income tax rate. And then this other category includes other revenue payments from the Federal Reserve, or things that might be more relevant to college students, which are alcohol and cigarette taxes. And then what's missing is how we run the annual deficit. So that is, we're spending more than we are taking in, so we're running an annual deficit. And now over time, these categories are changing. By 2027, we're going to be spending more as a share of the economy. Revenue as a share of the economy is going to go up a little bit. But as you can take a look in the spending category and compare it to the spending categories in 2017, so this is spending bar 1 and spending bar 2, discretionary as a share of the economy is shrinking. Healthcare, as a result of high healthcare costs that tend to increase greater than inflation, are increasing. You can see Social Security as a share of the economy is also increasing. This is a result of the retirement of the baby boomer generation. Other mandatory spending, based on these projections, is going to shrink as a share of the economy because these projections assume stable economic growth. But then the top bar, you can see interest as a share of the economy. That's greater than doubling. It's greater than doubling because we project that interest rates are going to go up over time. That is, they're going to normalize. They've been at a very, very low level since a result of the recession. But as well, we have that large stock of debt. So a large stock of debt, a growing stock of debt, and raising interest rates are all affecting interest as a share of the economy. And so as you can see, we're projected the deficit in 2017 was only going to be 3.6% of the economy, but it'll be over 5% of the economy by 2027. So this is deficits in nominal dollars. So as you can see, the deficit shot up a lot in 2009. This was a result of the recession. As a result of shrinking revenue because the economy was doing poorly, as well as increased social safety net spending. This is what we call automatic stabilizers in economics. Spending to make sure that people who really need money in economic downturns can get what they need, food stamps or unemployment insurance. And then also what caused this to increase a lot was stimulus spending at the time. The government decided that it'd be a good idea to spend money to try to stimulate the economy. So the deficit shot up to over $1 trillion, to over $1.4 trillion. And as a result of, to some extent, some mild fiscal restraint in discretionary spending, but primarily as a result of the economy strengthening over time, the deficit fell. But we've kind of reached the end of that now. Over the past couple of years, the deficit has increased every year. This is kind of because Congress has decided that on an annual basis, they were going to do some small tax cuts or some various forms of emergency spending or spending on the Defense Department overseas in Iraq and Afghanistan. And we've seen this increase over time. And CBO projects that this is going to keep increasing. This is a result of their baseline assumptions, but it's also a result of all this mandatory spending that's just keeps on going. So as you can see, we had a large increase in deficit, a fall in deficits, and now deficits are increasing again. So this is in nominal dollars. So this is debt again as a share of the economy. If you look at a similar time frame as to when the deficit shot up, you'll see the debt shoot up. So I'm going to go back one slide, and now the deficit. So you're going to see 2007, the deficit shoots up to 2009, 10, 11, 12. Now I'm going to go back forward. That's this corresponding area immediately before the dotted line that says actual. So we had debt as a share of the economy shot up, and that corresponded to the increasing deficit. Now, that the rate that increase went up has started to slow. That slowed in 2014, 13, 14, 15, and 16. And that corresponds, I'm going to go back to the last slide, to these low deficits that are roughly where we are today. And you can see 2011, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 are relatively low. And then they're projected to go up over time. And that results in kind of the speed in which the debt as a share of the economy is going to increase again. That's the current law debt projections. That dotted line above it, that's what we call alternative debt projections. That's something that we've put together here at the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, which is essentially saying if Congress keeps doing bad things fiscally, that is, does unpaid for spending increases, continues to increase tax cuts that they tend to do from time to time, we can see debt as a share of the economy will increase faster as is. So why is the debt growing? As I alluded to earlier, we had the economic crisis that led to a lot of lost revenue, increased spending on safety net programs. We responded to the economic crisis. We had stimulus spending and tax breaks. We had a financial sector bailout. And then we had big tax cuts, of course. We had the Bush tax cuts in 2001 and 2003. Those were set to expire in law. And at the time, Congress and the president decided to extend them. We extended them once in 2010. We made a big deal to extend most of them in 2013. And then in 2015, there was a larger deal on tax cuts that was made at the end of the year, into the calendar year. And then we had, of course, the war spending in Iraq and Afghanistan, which increased for a period of time and then started to fall, but over the past couple of years has increased again as well. And then what's driving the future growth in debt? What is the challenge that you all will face when you decide to come up with policies to make the fiscal future more sustainable? Well, we're dealing with rapid healthcare cost growth. This is a result of Medicare spending. Medicare spending is formulaic based on, it's an entitlement, which means if you reach the Medicare retirement age, 65, you are able to receive this healthcare benefit. And because of the aging baby boomer population, there's a lot more people that are going to be eligible for Medicare. A lot more people are eligible for Medicare, but then Medicare costs are growing faster than the economy. And this is the same with Medicaid costs. Healthcare is just a big problem we face from cost growth going forward in the future. And then, of course, population aging, as I had previously said, population aging primarily resolves itself in the Social Security program, as well as the Medicare program. And then revenues, of course, are going to fall as a result of population aging as well, because we have less high income earning baby boomers, and they'll be earning less in retirement. And so there's some effect on revenue as a result of that. And then we have growing interest costs, which is a result of normalization or return to more regular Federal Reserve policy. You can learn more about that in your introduction to macroeconomics class. They'll talk about that. And then insufficient revenue. This is the fact that we're running a deficit. We know what we're planning on spending over the next couple of years, but we are not planning on increasing the revenue that the government gets over that time period. So at some point, revenue is considered too low too. It's the mismatch that we see between spending and revenue that drives the deficit in a given year. So let's talk about population aging. This is just an example of how the population is aging. So this is the number of workers. So this is per Social Security retiree. So back in 1950, we had 16 people working and paying into Social Security for every one retiree. By 1960, that was 5 to 1. By 2012, that was 3 to 1. And in the next 20 years, it's looking like it's only going to be about 2 to 1. So this is a big challenge as the share of the U.S. population that is in the workforce is just generally declining over time as a result of the aging of the baby boom population. And so let's take a look at what is driving the spending growth. So this is a pie chart, and this is the percent of the nominal spending growth over the next 10 years from each category. So if Social Security was going from $1 trillion in spending today to $2 trillion in spending in 10 years, we're talking about that is about 28% of the total spending growth, the entire size of the pie, the entire size of the spending pie over time. So as you can see, Social Security, interest, and Medicare are really big chunks of this spending growth. If we take Medicare and add in the pink pie chart, pink pie, that's Medicaid, ACA, other major healthcare. Those two together make up to all major healthcare. So the red and the pink and the blue, Social Security, and the black, interest, those three areas account for 83% of the total nominal spending growth over the next 10 years. So that's the U.S. government is projected to spend $2.6 trillion more in 2027 than in 2017, and 83% of that is going to come from healthcare spending, Social Security spending, and interest on the debt. As you can see, other mandatory spending, which is this purple, and then the discretionary spendings, which are in green. Defense is the darker green. Non-defense discretionary is the lighter green. Those are growing over time, but they're not growing nearly as fast as the other major mandatory entitlement programs, Social Security, Medicare, and then other parts of healthcare, and then of course the growing interest costs. So let's look over the long term here. So this chart goes from today and is going out into 2047. So this is looking over the next 30 years. This data comes from the Congressional Budget Office's long-term budget outlook. They released these numbers in March. So each line here is as a share of the economy, measuring the size of the spending program. As you can see, this low line here, this dark blue other mandatory, it's projected to be flat and decrease over time. Discretionary spending is, of course, as well, decreasing over time and then remaining flat. Social Security spending is kind of increasing rather quickly over the next 20 years, and then is going to be rather flat. That's a result of the demographic assumptions. This is the population is aging to a certain point, and then the baby boomers that are 65, 75 now, eventually they're going to be 85, 90, and they may not be drawing on Social Security much longer as a result. And then healthcare spending. Healthcare spending is is growing very fast from not only just a current high level, but is going to continue to grow. Net interest, this gray line, which starts as the lowest category of spending, but will almost equal Social Security after 30 years. Net interest is by itself the fastest growing category of spending, and this is just kind of a result of compound interest over time. As you add more to the debt stock and interest rates rise a little bit, you're rolling over a larger and larger and larger stock of debt and financing it through bonds. So therefore, you're having your interest costs to the federal government are going to continue to increase over time. So when you're thinking about how you can rein in the fiscal situation, net interest is not something that you can readily affect unless you pull on all the other levers. It's kind of the remainder, it's an excess of results of all the other changes you've kind of made over time and the existing debt stock. So you could lower healthcare spending or lower Social Security spending or increase revenue. Those sorts of things would, by themselves, affect the net interest line. The net interest line would grow slower as a result of other lines growing slower or revenue growing faster, which is not on this chart. So let's just look at spending and revenue. We've had a gap in spending and revenue since the late 1990s, the last time the federal government balanced its budget. You can see these dotted lines I have on here are the 50-year average in revenue and the 50-year average on spending. Well, just because it's the 50-year average doesn't necessarily mean it's the right goal either, because the 50-year average on revenue and 50-year average on spending is at a deficit. So we're talking about over the past 50 years, we have really added to the debt. So this 50-year average is helpful to think about, but it's not the end-all be-all here, because what we're really talking about is how can we get revenue and spending, revenue being the green line at the bottom, spending being the blue line at the top, how can we get them closer together over time? So as you can see, the gap between spending and revenue widened a lot as a result of the recession, shrank, and now it's projected that revenue will grow a little bit over time and spending will grow more substantially over time. This is all as a share of the economy as well. So, ways that you can shrink this gap would be to increase revenue or make spending grow slower, or some combination of the two. And then, this leads the growing gap between revenue and spending that we saw at the end of the 10 years, this was 2027 in the last slide, are about a third of the way through the projected area of this current law debt. So this is the chart I showed earlier, and this shows that debt is really growing over time. And this is one of the kind of fundamental challenges that the United States faces. But of course, the longer we wait to do something, the harder it is to fix it because of interest costs and growing over time, and the actual size of what you need to do makes it a larger challenge if you wait. So this data is originally from the Congressional Budget Office, and we've done some calculations to it to get the nominal numbers that you see in the white inside each bar. But essentially, if we started this year and we wanted to stabilize the debt at 77% of the economy, or what it is today, you would need to reduce either non-interest spending or increase revenue or some combination of the two by about 1.9% of GDP each year for the next 30 years. You'd have to close a 1.9% of GDP gap. If you waited 5 years, that's going to go up. That's going to go up to 2.3% of the economy. You wait 10 years, if Congress does nothing for another 10 years, then a whole percentage point of GDP increase is needed in these annual changes. So it's just a result of the blue bars here. You're doing it in 30 years. The green bars, you're waiting 5 years and then doing it over the next 25. The red bars, you're waiting 10 and then doing it over the last 20. And then if you wanted to change your fiscal goal, so this is two different fiscal goals. One is stabilizing debt at 77% of GDP, that is making the debt as a share of the economy no worse by 2030 or by 2047, 30 years in the future. Or you could say, well, let's reduce debt to about 40% of the economy, which is roughly its 50-year average. So if we look back over the past 50 years, debt as a share of the economy was right about 39% of GDP. And so these changes are a lot. You may have to make more dramatic changes to reduce debt down to 40% of GDP. Stabilizing the changes you need to make are still relatively substantial. I mean, that's 1.9% of GDP over the next 10 years is equivalent to $4.5 trillion. How can I put $4.5 trillion in perspective? If you were to talk about everything that Hillary Clinton was promising from a social spending point of view in the 2016 campaign, that's about 1/3 of that blue bar. Now, what she was proposing would have been on the other side. Of course, this would have been not decreasing spending, but increasing spending. But that's roughly the size of it. We're talking about tax cuts right now here in Washington, D.C., and roughly the size of the tax cut that we're expected to see is going to be about $1.5 trillion. So that's $1.5 trillion in the wrong direction to do this 4.5 trillion, or the 1.9% of GDP over 30 years. So it's a big challenge that we face here, that I face kind of on a day-to-day basis when I'm looking at policy and things like that. But of course, it's not just spending. I talk a lot about spending. We also need to talk about the other side, and we're just talking about revenue, which is a very reasonable thing to propose, to increase revenue to deal with the fiscal challenges we face. But there's a couple different types of revenue we're talking about here. You have both the rates, the tax rates that we face. Currently, the highest marginal income tax rate is 39.6%. So that is, for every dollar that you earn at that top marginal rate, you pay the government 39.6% of that, or 39 cents and 0.6 cents for that additional dollar. But then there's also what we call tax expenditures, which can often be thought of as another type of spending. Tax expenditures aren't something that Congress budgets year to year, but they can be in many ways, shapes, and forms similar to government spending programs. This is like tax credits. This is deductions that businesses face and things like that. So from a policy point of view, you can think about the government can give out $1,000 in Pell Grants for tuition on your tuition for college, or they could give a tax credit for $1,000 to students for their education expenses, which would include tuition. So these are two ways that the government could do it. The government could give the money, or the government could credit students on their taxes. So if we were to count all these tax expenditures, which is more than just educational tax credits, there's a lot of these things. If we were to count at that as a share, as a type of spending, that would be just over a quarter of all spending in a given year. So this pie here is spending in 2017 plus all of the individual and corporate tax expenditures. So it's a larger pie than just the spending programs that I showed you in those original stacked bars. So as you can see here, the tax expenditures themselves are larger than Social Security or healthcare. They're larger than the combined discretionary spending. It's a very large thing. So trimming tax expenditures is another way to increase revenue that often is overlooked because we often like to just think about tax rates. Just as a brief aside, when we talk about tax reform here in Washington, we often talk about eliminating or removing or phasing out these tax expenditures, and then that increases revenue, and then decreasing revenue by lowering rates. So when we talk about tax reform, that's broadening the tax base by eliminating tax expenditures. More things are taxed, but we lower the rates in which we tax them. And these tax breaks have grown over time. These are inflation-adjusted dollars, so everything is in current dollars, 2017 dollars. Back when we had the last major tax reform, back in 1986, that lowered the value of these tax breaks dramatically at the time, from about just over 800 billion to just about 600 billion. But they've steadily grown over time, and they're projected to grow in the future, which is why a lot of us here in Washington like to talk about tax reform. So why do we care about the rising debt? It's a really important question, because right now I've just kind of been talking at you, and it can sound like I'm just trying to scare you, but there are actual consequences of rising debt. First kind of economic consequence we call it crowding out. So this is $1 of private sector investment may go to being $1 of a U.S. Treasury bond instead. You can think about this like, I have a bunch of money I might want to invest, but if I can get a pretty good return on a Treasury bond, that's pretty safe. Let me just put my money over there, as opposed to investing it in a company or something like that, which could lead to more economic growth if I'm investing in a company. So crowding out of private sector investment can over time lead to slower economic growth. And as a function of slower economic growth, we could see slower wage growth. So 30 years in the future, as a result of high and rising debt, our individual wages may end up being smaller as a result. Rising debt can also result in higher interest rates. The interest rates that the government pays rise over time with a larger debt, or can tend to, and are certainly projected to. But since a lot of interest rates throughout the economy are based on the rate that the U.S. government pays, because the U.S. government is kind of the biggest player in international debt markets, it can lead to higher interest rates for households, for businesses, and student loans. You could see higher interest rates. That may not affect those of you that are in college now, but it would certainly affect, when you have kids, what interest rates they may have on their student loans, or the interest rates that you'll pay when you want to buy a house in the future. Higher government interest payments can often displace other government priorities and investments. This is kind of a result of higher interest spending as a category means that the government may be more skittish to spend on other things because of the growing deficit. We can talk about reduced fiscal space. So the government can often react to wars or recessions or other national needs or emergencies by spending money or cutting taxes. Fiscal space is kind of the concept of how much ammunition you have left to do fiscal policy before you start running into real backlash through higher interest rates or just increased economic burden of the debt load. We don't really know how much fiscal space we have left, but we can certainly say that you have more fiscal space when debt is, as a share of the economy, is lower than when we necessarily have now. And then we're also dealing with insolvent entitlement programs. Social Security is projected to, the trust fund is projected to run out of money in the early 2030s. At that point, people on Social Security would see a cut in their benefits. That will be in a couple slides. And then, of course, we have the challenge of a possible fiscal crisis if changes are not made. We're not at a risk of a fiscal crisis, which is right now, because the U.S. economy is growing relatively stably. The debt is high, but not unmanageable. But it's the path that we're on, and the risks that the increasing that rising debt might cause, that might make international markets skittish. So it's something that we should be aware of. It's not a risk right now, and probably not a risk in the immediate future, but it's something to watch out on. So when I talked about rising debt will slow economic growth, this is per person income. This is in 2047 dollars. So, and then as you can see, based on CBO's, the Congressional Budget Office's modeling, this is average per capita GNP. As you can see, we have the baseline, which is the second one. If we actually increase the deficit more, or by about $2 trillion in their example scenario, per person GNP will actually decrease as a result of all these other factors. And prudent deficit reduction could actually increase per capita GNP over time as a result of less crowd out, more private investment, and those sorts of things. And then I mentioned Social Security. So in 2033, the Social Security trustees, which are the kind of independent group that makes projections on the Social Security program, they project that in 2033, the Social Security Trust Fund, in 2034, from 2033, the trust fund will kind of run out of money. So at that point, if nothing happens, these retirees will kind of face a large benefit cut all of a sudden. So a new retiree at age 62 in 2017. So if that's somebody that retired at the lowest retirement age today, they'll be 79 in 2034. They'll see their benefits drop from 2033 to 2034 by about $3,700 a year. This is an average retiree. And then as another example, somebody who's 51 now who will be who will retire at the regular retirement age, which will be 67 in 2033. Their first year, they'd get 25 grand in Social Security benefits, but they'd see their benefits fall by like over 25%, or by over 20%, excuse me, in 2034. So it's a big challenge. And you know, the projections that I had shown you earlier with debt rising, they make the assumption that these payments end up getting continued out. But Congress will have to do something to make those payments. So this is a large fiscal challenge that we don't face today, but we will face in the future. And something like Social Security is so easy to fix because we know the demographics, we know the math. The math is easy to do. If you slow benefit growth now, or increase taxation to go to the Social Security Trust Fund, these sorts of things compound over time and would dramatically lessen this cliff that we would face in 2034, or even prevent it from happening and push it out many more years. So I'm going to wrap up. So this is just a quote by the current director of the Congressional Budget Office, Keith Hall, and this is just, he is a nonpartisan professional here in government professional here in Washington, D.C. He heads the Congressional Budget Office, which is the nonpartisan group that scores bills or determines how much things cost and lays out the baseline or the general projections for what's going to happen going forward. This is what he says about the current debt path. You can read it for yourself. I'll end up passing these slides to Professor Aguilar, Mike Aguilar, and they'll be available online as a result, so you can go back and read this. So where can you learn more? So here's some resources. You're more than welcome to follow me on Twitter at econwonk. I'm pretty good at answering questions if you have them. My organization's Twitter handle, the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, our Twitter handle is @BudgetHawks. We're not on Instagram, so this is only Twitter. And then here are a variety of important websites for when you are looking to start your fiscal challenge project. Please visit our website at the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, www.crfb.org. We have a sister organization that breaks things down in a very simpler way called Fix the Debt. Definitely look at the Congressional Budget Office and all that they have. And then the Office of Management and Budget. The Office of Management and Budget is the president's, the White House's budget experts. So you can look at what the president has proposed to do for various fiscal things as well. Then there's a variety of online budget tools that are interesting to do and kind of get you a feel for the sorts of choices that you may need to make, including ones for Social Security reform, our own budget simulator, the CRFB budget simulator, and then the Brookings Institution also has a budget simulator called the Fiscal Ship. So these are just a variety of ideas where you can learn more. And that's all I've got. So let's take some questions.
Yeah, Zach, this is Mike. I thought maybe I could start it off to ask a few questions on behalf of my students, and then anybody who's listening, if you weren't able to catch the beginning, if you do want to ask a question, there's a chat feature, and you can click on the chat and then send it out to the group, and Zach can respond that way. But I guess I had a ton of questions. I want to ask them all. Some are technical, some are more of a political in nature.
Okay.
Early on in the beginning of the presentation, it was maybe slide 4, slide 5, you had this picture of the debt to GDP ratio changing over time. And I guess I'm wondering, to do an attribution analysis. Historically, these decreases in debt to GDP, is that because of the numerator or denominator? And if it's numerator, is it historically coming from the expenses side, outlays, or more the revenue side?
Gotcha. Okay. Like this chart, right, that I have up. Can everyone see that?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is the historic chart. So when we talk about this function, we do have, you're right, Mike, absolutely. We have the numerator and the denominator. The numerator in any given year is the total stock of debt. The stock of debt changes over time as a result of annual deficits. Annual deficits are a result of both spending and revenue. And then the denominator is GDP. And so, if the stock of debt didn't change, but the GDP went up, you'd see the debt to GDP ratio shrink over time. And that's just mechanically how this is working. But immediately after World War II, we, because we were running very large deficits as a result of fighting World War II, the annual deficits shrunk dramatically, both as a result of lower spending because we weren't spending on fighting the largest war, as well as increasing revenue through taxes. So that's a big part of it. And then you have general economic growth, which is happening over time, and that's driving a very good chunk of it as well. But I think a very good example to think about is look at this 1980 to 1990 category. We see debt as a share of the economy is growing. It's kind of growing, or it hadn't grown in a while. The economy is actually doing pretty well in the latter half of the 80s. In the early 80s, the economy is struggling. There's a couple of recessions, but in the latter half, the economy is doing pretty well. But we have big tax cuts in the early Reagan years that are then partially undone, as well as we have another large increase in defense spending. So, in an example like that is, even though you have a growing economy, the debt is growing simultaneously because of large spending and low revenue. If you look at the 1990 to 2000 era, the first Bush and the Clinton years, the Clinton year drop is a result of both good GDP growth, the denominator, but it's also really good fiscal policy. Or, we increased taxes in 1993. We had a variety of bipartisan budget deals to lower spending. And so that's kind of, it drops so quickly as a result of both slow growth, very slow growth, and eventual decrease in the numerator, and growth in the denominator, the GDP. And then the most recent rapid rise in debt, that's mostly a result of the economy. The economy shrunk, and that was very bad, but then the deficit increased as a result. So, the GDP is not completely independent of the numerator. Is another important thing to think about, I guess, because a recession can cause decreases in revenue and increases in spending on its own. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. I'm asking these on behalf of some of my students. I think that's a great way to put it. On I'm looking at the chat feature. I don't see any right now. I might be using it improperly, but I do have some more that I think would be beneficial to the students.
Sure.
Shortly after this slide, you started talking about the 10-year budget windows. And when you were talking about that, you were mentioning the prospect of the government shutdown, how we averted that. You didn't mention it by name, but intimated by your point was this idea of the debt ceiling.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if maybe for the benefit of the students, could you tell us a little bit about the debt ceiling? In particular, I get the question often, why was this implemented in the first place? What was the original purpose of the debt ceiling? Because now it seems like it's being used for almost a political tool, but there had to have been a different economic reason initially.
Yeah. So, okay. So the history of the debt ceiling, we have a paper on this. It's called Debt Limit 101, and I'll pass that to you, Mike, and you can send that around to your students. So originally, Congress kind of authorized each issuance of bonds, and so they were like, all right, we're going to issue $1 million of 10-year bonds. And that became, over time, really burdensome on Congress to pass all of these laws for all of this debt management. And so they just kind of left it up to the Treasury Department to do on its own. But they said, okay, we still want the power of the purse because we're Congress, and so we're gonna say you can't increase the debt above a certain level. And that is when we kind of got the debt ceiling, debt limit established. I use the debt ceiling and debt limit interchangeably. Mm-hmm. And so over time, no one really likes to raise the debt limit here in Washington because it can be very political. But all it is saying we're just going to pay our credit card bill. We've already racked up all these bills for all this spending and for all the deficits that we've agreed to increase over time. But we're actually just going to say, all right, let's just make sure we actually finance this this increase. Over the past 5 to 10 years, it's gotten a lot more political, and that's resulted in a lot of kind of market worry and things like that. But it's mostly, the debt limit is kind of it's a constant reminder of fiscal responsibility, and it should never be breached or should never be breached, because then we would be talking about defaulting on U.S. debt, which we've never done before, and so it could lead to, a large economic calamity. But it's a good reminder from time to time that this is what we've decided to do, and so maybe we should pursue policies that slow the growth of debt over time. I've actually worked on a variety of papers about other ways to reform the debt limit. And that's available. Those are available on our website. So if you're looking for other ideas and other ways that we could deal with the debt limit, besides just kind of getting rid of it. But that being said, there's not many countries with a debt limit. We have a debt limit in the United States, and it's mostly for political reasons. And then I forget if it's Denmark or Finland. One of the two of them, I believe, has a debt limit as well. Yep. Does that answer your question?
Yes, most definitely. I have two more, if you don't mind.
No problem.
These are more of your perspective from being in DC. I'm trying to get a sense of the political recognition of the quote-unquote problem right now. Do you get the sense of this debt problem in DC? Is it that everyone necessarily agrees that there is a problem and they're simply debating how to deal with the problem? Or is there a disagreement as to whether or not there actually is a problem?
That's a tough question. I actually think it's a little bit of both. I think everyone agreed it was a problem back when we were running high annual deficits. I'll go to that slide right now. And yeah. So I would say we had a lot of concern over the fiscal issues in 2009, 10, and 11 when we were running over $1 trillion deficits annually, and that the deficit is a yearly problem. The debt is a long-term issue. So the immediacy of high deficits, I think, drove drove a lot of Washington, D.C. to really care about it. And as the economy recovered and the deficit decreased, and they did do some spending reforms through what we call the Budget Control Act, which capped discretionary spending, or the annually decided upon spending. It slowed the growth of that spending. It cut it and slowed its growth. That made policymakers feel like they did something, and so as a result, kind of the pressure was off them. Clearly, a group like mine who advocates for reasonable federal budgets, we never stopped, but I can definitely see policymakers really stop caring. I worked in the Senate starting in 2011, when this was absolutely a big issue. In 2011 and 2012, it was a very, very big issue, and it was something we really cared about, and my boss, the senator, really cared about. And then just over time, I think when the pressure is off, DC cares about it less. There's a lot of talk now about people saying they care about it, but in actuality, look at policy, look at proposals. Where the rubber meets the road, we're really not seeing a lot of substantial fiscal responsibility in Washington. We're talking about right now, the big debate here in town is tax cuts or tax reform. To me, and this is my personal opinion, tax reform is about lowering tax expenditures, lowering rates, hopefully getting a little bit of revenue for deficit reduction, and simplifying the tax code. But right now we're seeming to talk more about tax cuts. We're talking about lowering rates, maybe getting rid of some expenditures, but primarily lowering rates. And they may not get to be permanent. They may not get to be a permanent tax change because of the budget rules that exist here in town. So, certainly I think we've seen that the pressure is off, and policymakers here in town don't seem to, their actions are speaking louder than their words.
Yeah. Actually, that segues nicely into the last question, because you were mentioning your opinion about the differences between tax cuts and tax reform. Part of the goal of the competition, of the fiscal challenge, is for the students to develop their own plan, and they need to find potential solutions. Do you have, either under the auspices of the CRFB or personally, an idea of the single best solution? No one solution I know is going to solve the entirety of the problem, but one that has the biggest bang for the buck?
Well, that's a really tough question. That's a really tough question, because when we're talking about making our debt to GDP ratio, essentially stop growing over the long term, which is a very reasonable fiscal goal. That would be stabilizing the debt. When you talk about that, there's, a lot of little things can really add up. We need to figure out ways and be innovative on ways to slow the growing cost of healthcare spending. And that could be through additional regulation. It could be through maybe instituting a public exchange. It could be even something that I may not be in favor of, but I know a lot of people like talking about universal health care. The ability of universal health care to slow spending growth could be a very, very important thing. Universal health care would increase spending a lot, because it would be shifting a burden onto the government. And so you'd have to absolutely raise taxes to pay for it, or change the makeup of what the government spends money on. But something like that could over time slow the cost growth and spending. Or you could be talking about ways that we just make people healthier. So that's healthcare is a big deal. We have a lot of the spending growth is just kind of on autopilot as a result of the aging baby boomer population. So there's no silver bullet to deal with that, unless you just maybe make benefits like Medicare, like Social Security, that deal with this aging population more progressive. that is make it for people that are lower income or have lower retirement savings, so that they're provided a general safety net as they age. But somebody who's saved a lot of money and has the ability to pay more could pay more. And then you got to talk about growing the economy and tax reform. I would like to see personally revenue raised. We've cut a lot of revenue over time, and so that's got to be a role. Something like a carbon tax could be an interesting way to do it, because we're dealing with another long-term challenge, which is climate change, and so a carbon tax, something to help mitigate both climate change and raise revenue, could be an interesting thing. But basically, yeah, there's no one quick fix. It's really tough to do it just through spending. It's really tough to do it just through revenue. It really takes a balanced approach, and a lot of groups in town throughout the years have tried to take various balanced approaches. What we call the Simpson-Bowles Fiscal Commission, the Domenici-Rivlin Commission. These are groups that have tried to look at everything all at once and see what they can do. At the very end of my slides, we had our budget simulator. That has a variety of interesting options, but those are kind of the tired, well-worn options here in Washington for the most part. You can meet all these fiscal goals with them, but at some point they're not very innovative. And I know as when I judged the fiscal challenge last year, one of the things that we really looked for was people going outside of the box and thinking of innovative ways, and that was something that we really cared about and valued. So that's the perspective that I like to I look forward to seeing from high school students and college students when they do the fiscal challenge.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense too. There's no single silver bullet, but healthcare spending, aging population, tax reform, we have to tackle these, and in multiple myriad ways. That's great. You know what? It's a little bit after 7. Why don't we break here, unless there's anything else that you wanted to add, Zach?
No, there's nothing else I'd like to add. I just say that I'll get you a copy of this presentation in some form, and you'll be able to put it up. And if anyone has any further questions, please feel free to reach out on Twitter at EconWalk. I'm happy to answer some questions, explain anything that you might need explained. I'm not going to help you when it's time to work on your own fiscal challenge project. I'm going to stay away from that. But if there's any further questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. It's part of my job to help educate the general public on these things. So I appreciate you guys for having me and listening to me talk about kind of what I do all day. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you sincerely for helping us out, and thanks to our partners at HPS. As Zach had said, the recording of the webinar as well as the slides will be on our Fiscal Challenge website probably in a few days. And I also want to encourage everybody listening, either live or in the recording, to go ahead and sign up for the Fiscal Challenge. We have a registration deadline of January 15th in 2018. If you register early, we get you updates. We have one-on-one training with HPS as well as with myself, and then submissions are going to be due in March. So we have plenty of time to work on your detailed proposals. Thank you very much, everybody. I appreciate it.